just a couple of stories, just a couple of sort of things that I'll kind of start with.
Get us started. Okay.
Yeah, just to kind of see, I guess, conceptually with this concept.
Oh, okay, that's good.
Okay, so thanks again for joining us.
Absolutely.
We've done a lot of these. In the last ones, we talked about density,
Yep.
3 episodes. But even some of the ones before that, we talked about downtowns. We spent a lot of time talking about downtowns.
Right.
And just a lot of different elements of them with economic development, revitalization, and density. And so I was looking at this book, and we'll let you talk a little bit about the book in a minute, but it's a book that you contributed to called Design Downtown for Women, and Men Will Follow.
Right.
And so I thought this was kind of perfect fit for what we've been talking about with downtowns, because even looking at the book, it's just the back of it talks about things we talked about. Downtown is the heart and soul of every city, but they've failed to achieve their full potential. We talked about that in the last episode, even with talking about market share. And this talks about sort of that experience, though, and something we haven't really talked so much about, and what's that experience for women, being their desires and needs, and being the most important demographic for a downtown to succeed. And so it made me think of a couple of things that not specifically downtowns. Well, one is sort of downtown, but it's not about the overall downtown experience, but it's maybe the same similar concept. But the concept that design downtown for women and men will follow. And so I remember, this must be 20 years at least, of a friend of ours, an acquaintance, someone we both know, got hired and was doing some economic development work in downtown Miami.
Okay.
And I remember him telling me that he was meeting with the manager, or either the bar manager or the hotel manager of the Holiday Inn that was downtown, close to the river.
Got it. Yeah.
And I remember meeting him at that bar once. And this title of this book reminded me of it, because he told me that the conversation he had with the bar manager was sort of this, well, he was trying to figure out how to get more business to the bar at the Holiday Inn.
Right.
And so they were kind of brainstorming about that. And he's like, well, what do you have? I mean, it's not a South Beach club. It's a generic Holiday Inn bar. And finally the manager said, well, you know what I have? I have stewardesses. This is where all the stewardesses are staying.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it's like, okay, that's a way to get the men to follow.
Right.
And then the other thing it reminded me of is, 25 years ago, back when I was younger and living in South Beach and working in South Beach, it just reminded me of the clubs. It's that same concept.
Absolutely.
If you're a single man, if you're lucky enough to get past the velvet rope in one of the clubs, you're paying.
Yes.
If you show up with a woman on your arm, you're still going to have to pay, but you're going to get in. Show up with 2 women on your arm, you're definitely getting in.
You're getting pushed to the front of the line, right?
Yeah, and so it was that, and so it made me think about even just at that level, they're not just designing, but they're operating.
Right.
They're operating under that sort of concept that's more about the public realm and the overall downtown experience is talking about. So.
Right, and for a club environment, it has a certain kind of connotation to it, which is, people are trying to meet each other and,
right.
That kind of thing. But even in a broader sense for downtowns, the way I like to describe it is, and men don't like to hear this, but, the decisions that get made about where to go and spend time and money, even if you're part of a group or part of a couple or whatever, that place decision, which is a go or no go kind of decision,
right.
is, men don't have a veto so much, but women always have a veto, and they use it extensively because they don't want to go someplace where they don't feel safe enough,
right.
or they don't feel comfortable, or even if they just don't like it, right? But there's a market dynamic, and there's a decision tree dynamic that women have the majority of influence over. And it really is about, if you're going to pick where to buy a house, and the statistics prove this out. And there's something that a lot of people call the She-conomy, that basically says, 80% plus of decisions are, made or strongly influenced by women on any kind of level of purchase, including cars, which was one that surprised me at one point in time.
Right.
But so the truth is, if in fact you have an offering, a place offering, I'll call it, that is attractive enough and feels comfortable enough and safe enough for women, they're going to lead. And the truth is, most of the time they're deciding whether or not a group or a couple is going to go there as well. And so the follow part is, kind of true. But the fact is, the men don't want to be places that are dead, and places that don't have women in them typically are dead.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and it's almost just a further level of, when I talk about economic development, we talk about, at the end of the day, we're creating places people want to be.
Right.
And that's what you're doing, whether it's a private business or public space and the public realm. And that we can do all the analysis we want, and we can look at market data. We can look at Yelp reviews if we're going to a restaurant. Right. We can look at crime stats when we're buying a home. Right. But even no matter how good all of those numbers look, when you pull up in front of that restaurant, if you're just not feeling it, you're just not feeling it. And this is sort of reinforces and gets even deeper into, I guess, that decision tree.
It is. I mean, and what has been a challenge, and still is in many places, is what we think that decision tree is versus what it really is, right? So we have a tendency in our society to think it's about crime statistics and police presence, and that's not really necessarily what it is. And if you read the book, it talks about cleanliness, it talks about bathrooms, it talks about comfortable seating. I talk a lot about a concept I call safe enough and varying safety thresholds, which means what's safe enough for Kevin and Ken may not be safe enough for my 30-something daughter, or even a 20-something young woman, or my mom. It's going to be different depending on your target market. And if you don't pay attention to that, you're never going to get your place to safe enough to get their time and money. And so it's an important part of it. There are lots of factors that go into it, but I like to think about a few that are really what I call kind of bottom of the pyramid choices, and like some of the first choices in the decision tree. Is it interesting? Is one, right? Is it going to meet one of my whatever my need is? But the third one is it going to be safe enough? And those are early decisions about where to spend your time and money that we have a tendency to ignore, even in our marketing and our market research and those kinds of things. So we try to get after that.
Right. So it seems, I was thinking about these just in the context of the other sort of pieces of our approach.
Right.
And, when we talk about like some of the three most important things that we talk about a lot with quality life and creating that place are those connections people have to their community,
right? Which
the top three are the aesthetics and how it looks and feels, the social offerings, the opportunities to engage with one another.
Yes, absolutely.
And then how open and welcoming the place is.
Right.
And there's safety is an important component of all three of those.
It's woven into all of that, and the truth is, we feel the least safe when we feel isolated. Now you can be isolated in a crowd, but parking garages, for example, we talk about lighting and all those other kinds of things, and I always try to remind people, look, it's fine, your lighting's good, everything else, but if I'm in there and I feel like if I scream nobody's going to hear me or respond, then I'm isolated. It's not safe for me. And so having other people around is actually what creates the safety. People that we feel will help us if we're in need. And so kind of what you were just talking about, that ability to interact and those kinds of things.
Right. It's sort of, it makes me think that some of the approach when you're thinking about safety is not so much, is how do you, well, I think about it with economic development. I think about it my time in Miami Beach.
Yeah.
And in the 17 years I was there doing economic development, we never had a standalone economic development plan. And we have a lot of clients, and we write these economic development plans, but one of the things we write in there is look for the ways that we integrate that economic development plan into their citywide strategic plan and into everything that they do. Because when we did it in Miami Beach, that's how we did it. I was part of, the leadership team for our citywide strategic plan, and we built economic development in throughout everything we did. It was done that, and even my last few years there, the city manager even reorganized and changed economic development from being a department and moved me and the economic development function into the city manager's office as a function from the city manager's office rather than being this separate department. And so what you were describing there sounds like, you have to think almost everything that you're doing, start thinking of it with a safety sort of mindset or a context. The context of safety as part of what you do.
It's a perspective, yeah.
Sort of the way that resiliency is now becoming something that people start thinking of, no matter what discipline they're working in, how do we incorporate?
Right. Resiliency isn't just for your water and sewer engineers, right? And safety is not just for your police department.
Right.
So, we write these community safety action plans, and one of the best quotes that I got back from a client one time about it was, "Okay, Ken, I think I understand. This is all hands on deck." Right? So everybody has a role to play when it comes to real and perceived safety. And one of the challenges is people don't understand what that role might be for them. If they're a planner or someone who runs events, or, I had an interesting conversation one time with a historic preservation person and walked them through the things that they can do to actually help with this. And they were like, at the end of it, they were like, wow, I never really thought about it that way. And so that's part of what we help people understand.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, kind of on that, I guess, and you're right, safety is more than just what police do.
Absolutely.
But I think that in most people's minds, when they think of safety, police is the first place they go. I think even pros in our field, when we think about redevelopment, because we're not safety experts. A CRA manager is not an expert in safety really at all. And so it seems like a lot of the times when we look at CRAs at redevelopment agencies, and state law in Florida lets CRAs use their tax increment revenue for what in the statute says community policing innovations.
Correct.
But I think that a redevelopment, most people, that they're not in that field, and so they don't really know what that means. What is that? So you ask your police department, and a lot of times the answer to that you get is the community the innovative community policing that you need is overtime.
Is more police.
And that's what we see.
Yes.
But are there some examples that, and obviously police have their role, and police are an important part of our public safety and our economic development, our quality of life. But are there some other things, best practices or things that you've worked on in some of the places that with your safety action plans, I think that's what it's called?
Community safety action plans.
That's
what we call them.
That enhance and go beyond just that policing role, but into really getting it back to what we say, creating it as a real place that people want to be. Because having too many police doesn't make it a place you want to be either.
No, not typically. Sometimes actually that is what's needed, but it's a custom solution, right? But the truth is that the marketplace is driven by perceptions of safety, not actual safety, right? So that decision tree we talked about earlier, my decision about whether or not to spend time on South Beach right now is driven by my perception of the safety, not the actual safety. And the police departments will talk about perceptions, and I think they truly want to impact perceptions, but rarely measure them. And so, CRAs and even downtown organizations, unfortunately, are not particularly good at this. And so we try certain things and we talk about all the efforts we've made to improve perceptions, but we don't actually measure or even kind of figure out how to track what's really working. And again, what's really working depends on your age, your gender, your background, your familiarity with urban environments, all those different things. We know this. The research is very clear on this. And so I would say that one of the best practices that we bring to our clients and to the communities where we help them with this is make the shift to think and talk about perceptions. And I think people get a little nervous about that sometimes, that, well, no, we really have to really pay attention to real crime. We can't ignore real crime. And and my response is always, no, of course not. Always pay attention to real crime. It's the first thing we do, is to understand what's really going on versus what the perceptions might be. And oftentimes, and there's some really good research around this, when a place has had challenges around real crime and perception, after the real crime gets fixed, the negative perception lingers because no one's really managing the perception. And we call it a brand attribute. Go ahead.
Well, and that's one of the notes that I made was about that, because we recently, I'm not going to name where, but we recently worked in a place that we partnered, and that was one of the things that you mentioned.
Right.
And I guess, how do you overcome the, institutional challenge of redeploying your resources when that happens? Because it's once you start putting program money towards addressing the real crime and safety issue, whether it's overtime or toys or whatever it is, once the real crime issue is addressed but the perception and the reputation is not, how do you...
The tendency is to double down on what you were doing, right?
Yeah, so how do you pull back and reevaluate and redeploy your resources to deal with that reputational thing? Because I think you're right. And that was the other question I had for you. Another thing that happened in Miami Beach was at one point we made a big improvement we had a horrible reputation for being bureaucratic, anti-business, having development processes that drag on forever, and they really did.
Right.
And we made some real improvements in some of those processes of getting your permit and stuff. But I remember having a conversation with a commercial real estate broker who did a lot of national tenant type work. And he mentioned 2 or 3 businesses, retailers, who had looked at the beach and decided to go elsewhere on the mainland. And he told me that it was the permitting process was the reason. And I said to him, we fixed that. I said, we fixed that like 2 or 3 years ago. And his comment was, well, nobody believes it.
Right. And so there are a couple of things that you have to understand. What you're talking about is a brand repositioning there. And in the case of the building department, it's an organizational brand repositioning. And if you aren't intentional about that, it doesn't just happen, right? And the same goes for safety. When you've had that kind of problem, if you are not, measuring whether or not you're making progress, we talked about that already, and thinking about what it is that actually impacts those perceptions. Beyond police presence, and there's some research that tells you that doesn't actually have much of an impact because it's so sporadic. But we know that the physical environment is a big impact on people's perceptions, and that's day and night, and has to do with something that we call territoriality. That comes out of crime prevention vernacular, from crime prevention through environmental design. But it's really about what are the indicators of care and concern that you see when you're in that community. And it can be a lot of different things. We look a lot at public art, colorful flowers, manicured lawns. Interestingly enough, front yard fences can communicate that. But if you think about, the places you go where you really feel super comfortable, you will begin to notice what's there that says someone cares about this place, and if something goes wrong, they're probably going to come out of their house and help me, kind of thing, right? Or out of their business and help me. So that's certainly one of them. But even the way that you activate places and who you activate those places for. So we talk a lot about events. with our clients. And one of my there are two favorite kinds of events that I like to advise my clients about. One is after dark events for young children, and the other is events for people and their dogs. And both of those are, the children and the dogs are very protected groups, right? So people don't let bad things happen around their kids or their dogs. And so if they're there, then that's an indicator to others that, well, there's a bunch of kids here. This must be a safe place. There's a bunch of people with their dogs of all sizes and everything else, and everybody's really protective of them. So it must be a pretty good safe. So there's a lot of different things that are physical environment, but also activity-based, that are important to help you communicate those things. And you just have to get really intentional about them. And back to your resources question, what we find is that people are already doing events, right? People are already, looking at their physical environments. They're spending money on landscaping. They have design guidelines for what things look like, but they aren't integrating these kinds of solutions about safety perceptions into them most of the time. 90% of the time is what we find. And so you don't need new resources. You actually just need a different lens. You need a different perspective. And you just have to understand that this is something that's really fundamentally important that you got to do. The last part of this is, this is kind of the third prong in what we do, is, and this is a challenge for a lot of nonprofits and governments, is there really is a strategic communications component if you want to reposition a brand or even an attribute of a brand. And you have to be incredibly thoughtful about it. And we talk a lot about indirect messages when it comes to safety. And one of my favorite quotes is, would a mall manager say or do that, right? And we could say lifestyle center now. It used to be malls, but would a lifestyle manager actually say that? If you're working as a downtown person, would they actually hold a march? No, they wouldn't, because they're paying very close attention to the place brand perception of their property. Well, downtowns have to do the same thing.
And even in our density conversation, we talked about that, about how, mall managers and the sort of the retail shopping center industry out more in suburbia have been able to do things because we haven't done them in our downtowns, and how they're able to, they're able to move quicker and they're able to respond quicker.
They are.
But they're very market responsive,
right, when
we're not always market responsive. And I think even less so when we think about safety in our downtowns. We're being market responsive in the context of safety is not something that I think comes to mind a lot when we talk about, in some of our downtowns and in economic development.
And it's, and again, we know that downtowns, multiplicity of ownership, you've got multiple, organizations at play and everything else. And it's not impossible to get better at it, but it is difficult. And so you need really strong leadership that understands the importance of doing this. But sometimes it's just people just need to be educated that, look, you just need to go at this a little bit differently. If you're going to have your police chief talking about safety, here are some ways that they really need to be thoughtful about not just protecting their organizational brand, which is they have to, I get that, but also protecting the place brand and positioning the place brand. Some officials do that instinctively. It's really great to watch them because they always go there. They're always protecting the place brand because they understand the value of that. But a lot of them don't. Right. And so that's just part of what we know we have to get our clients to understand and begin to think about. And we write plans for them. We actually give them very specific instructions. We talk to a lot. Some of them actually need crisis communications plans around safety because they still have real problems. Right. And if they're on their second or third strike, it can be a really devastating thing to recover from.
So, a couple of the other things that, one is